Good evening, Tehillah. Good evening, everyone. If you have a Bible or a device, Genesis chapter 1, first page of the story, chapter 1, will be there in just a moment. If you're a new friend or an old friend or not yet a friend, just delighted that you're here to spend some time with us on a Monday night as we dive into God's Word together. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. See, the mind is its own place with a power in and of its very self to make a heaven of hell, but also to make a hell of heaven. These words come from book 1 of what is widely considered to be one of the most significant poems to have ever been written in the English language, John Milton's Paradise Lost. The poem, which was originally published across a series of 10 books in 1667, retells the story of Adam and Eve, and by extension, all of humanity, by using rhythm, sound, and meter to reactualize the scriptural narrative in poetic form. These words that we just read, that were penned 357 years ago, highlight to us both the power, but also the threat of our mental landscapes. We all, every single one of us in the room, within our very selves, within the place we refer to as the mind, possess the ability to make heaven of hell or hell of heaven. Stated differently, we possess in our mind the ability to reframe, whether it be positively or negatively, by choice or circumstance, through freedom or force. We can reframe events. You see, the mind is its own place, and in itself can make heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. I think these words tap into something with which we are all very familiar. Our mind, our mental landscapes, what we've come to refer to as our mental health, can bend heaven toward hell, or it can bend hell toward heaven. I think we see it in our classrooms and on our campuses. We see it in our streets and in our families. We see it in our workplaces, and we see it in our friends. And maybe most of all, if we're honest, we recognize it within the confines of our own minds. According to recent data, 1 in 5 people in our city experiences mental health challenges each year. And by the age of 40, 1 in 2 people, that is 50% of individuals, will have experienced significant mental health challenges. Now, these statistics are jarring, but they become even more jarring when we isolate the data among youth and young adults. That is the demographic that's represented in the room. The most recent data that was collected in 2023 indicates that 87% of people between the age of 15 and 34 regularly experience mental health challenges. 87%. 58% of the surveyed group said they regularly experience anxiety, while stress falls closely behind at 54%, and 42% regularly reported wrestling with depression, and over 1/4 of those surveyed, that is 26%, reported that they regularly felt panicked. A 2021 study that surveyed over 33,000 college students, notice the magnitude of that, 33,000 college students, similarly found that 73% of those surveyed reported feeling moderate to severe psychological distress. The results are even similar among smaller studies of the same nature, which present a kind of clear and cohesive narrative of the mental health conditions that are faced by students nationwide. In fact, a 2021 study that was conducted by Cornell University, an Ivy League school, found that 40% of students said they were non-functional for at least 1 week of the year due to depression, stress, or anxiety. Another study conducted in early 2022 found that 88% of students said they think there is a mental health crisis on college and university campuses across the United States. 88% said they feel as though there is a mental health crisis on college campuses. And in the wake of this kind of record high reporting of mental health challenges with varying forms of anxiety and depression, many of us, most of us, all of us have turned to various types of unhealthy coping mechanisms. See, in the face of anxiety, depression, or stress that sort of bleeds into every part of our lives, we've turned to medicating, distracting, and indulging. We turn to these coping mechanisms to try to return to a positive feeling state, but in doing so, we often overlook the harmful side effects that come from repeated use of these coping mechanisms. We medicate with drugs, whether they be antidepressants or anti-anxiety medication or other extreme forms of pills like opioids. The use of antidepressants or anti-anxiety medication, which, to be clear, we as a community support, it's worth noting that it's increased each year, being up more than 35% in the last 3 years. While 10 million people in the United States misused opioids this last year to try to numb their pain. But it's not just that we medicate, we also distract with our phones and other forms of media. The average adult spends around 147 minutes a day on social media, which means they spent the equivalent of 37.3 days of their year on social media. Another study conducted in 2021 found that the average adult consumes 13 hours of digital media a day. We also overindulge with food, sex, and spending. We overeat to curb our negative emotions. We accumulate sexual encounters to fill the hole. We consume more and more just to feel full. And we desire the more and the more and the more, and that only increases our dissatisfaction. In her book, Dopamine Nation, Stanford's director of addiction medicine, Anna Lemke, writes this: "We're living in a time of unprecedented access to high-reward, high-dopamine stimuli. Drugs, food, news, gambling, shopping, gaming, texting, sexting, Facebook, Instagramming, YouTubing, tweeting. The increased numbers, variety, and potency are staggering. The smartphone is the modern-day hypodermic needle, delivering digital dopamine 24/7 for a wired generation. As such, we've all become vulnerable to compulsive overconsumption." She actually goes on to explain the ways that each of these coping mechanisms are causing a severe imbalance for the pain-pleasure scale in our brains. They may provide momentary reprieve, but in the long term, they do nothing to improve our mental health. In fact, they only worsen our mental health. And all this noise that occupies our mental landscapes, the anxiety we feel in our bodies, the way we feel weighed down by our depression, it propels us towards medicating, distracting, and indulging. But there are many others, as we all know, who, when not aided by these coping mechanisms, when they experience no relief in the face of the anxiety and the depression and the stress, they turn to self-harm. According to Stats Canada, 840,000 people have had serious thoughts of suicide this past year. 25,000 of which made suicide plans. 100,000 have attempted suicide. 20,000 have been hospitalized due to self-harm, and 4,500 people have been lost to suicide, which is 12 people in our nation every day. Suicide is actually the second leading cause of death among youth and young adults, 15 to 34. And while suicide rates are 3 times higher among men make up 75% of those who commit suicide. Women attempt suicide 3 to 4 times more. And there are others still who, in the face of the anxiety and the depression and the stress, turn to mental health supports, which we will offer throughout this series. And while these are more prominent and they're less stigmatized and they're frequently discussed, these resources are often not easily accessible. They place a significant financial burden upon us as individuals. Stigma continues to pollute our understanding, and we often discuss at the expense of moving towards remedies. In fact, only 15% of Canadians have accessed mental health services this past year. And one study even indicates that 1 in 2 people facing mental health challenges are not currently receiving the required supports. 50% of people who are struggling with anxiety and depression and stress are not receiving adequate support. We see it in our classrooms. We see it in the streets. We see it in our families and our workplaces and our friends. And most of all, if we're honest, we see it in the confines of our own minds. I remember not long ago frequently feeling as though my chest was going to cave in. Plagued by panic attacks, overcome by anxiety, unable to force myself out of bed, stressed by mounting pressures. I remember feeling alienated and alone, and grief occupied this space in my body in spite of the fact that it was not invited, and heaviness was weighing down on my heart. And I remember the noise and the clamor and the fuzziness. You see, the mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, but it can make a hell of heaven. Are you with me? These words, which were penned by a poet 357 years ago, cut to the heart of the epidemic that we are facing. We are at a crisis point. The problem is pervasive. We live in a mental health moment. And in the face of our mental health moment, we're invited to ask some important questions, ones that we are probably already asking. How do we understand terms like anxiety and depression and stress? How do we think holistically about our health? What is our response to our mental health moment? But maybe most importantly, and asked most directly, how do we navigate our mental health moment? If you're in the room and you do not follow Jesus, welcome. This question is as relevant to you as it is to us, but if you're in the room and you follow Jesus, I need you to hear me together tonight that this moment that we're in requires a response from us. Are you with me? That we actually have to learn to navigate this moment well as followers of King Jesus. Because as we're going to discuss and as we're going to see tonight, our scriptures, the sacred writings, our Bible, the God who made us for holistic health. He made us for integration, not for disintegration. And these questions, at the heart of those questions, how do we navigate our mental health moment, are at the heart of this new series we are starting tonight called Sound Mind. And at the heart of the series, we want to open up conversation and ask serious and real questions about the mental health moment that we live in. We want to, as a team, try to help demystify and clarify terminology. We want to try to begin to reconfigure our instincts to cover issues and discuss techniques that are grounded in research, to think through the spiritual dynamics of our mental health, and maybe most importantly, to learn to think holistically about our health as followers of Jesus. And over the course of this series, we're going to talk about anxiety and depression and coping mechanisms and self-talk and other strategies for holistic health, all with one aim. The aim for this series is that we as followers of Jesus in our city in 2024 could learn to become people whose minds do not make hell of heaven, but can learn to make heaven of hell. That we can learn together not only for ourselves, but for the sake of others, not to make hell of heaven, but to make heaven of hell. And so on the docket for tonight, as we begin this series, I want to talk about 4 things that should be up here on the screen behind me, something like this. I want to talk about mental health definition and distinctions. I want to talk about the bio-psycho-social spiritual model. I want to talk about our disintegration narrative in Genesis 3. And then in the end, I want to offer 7 features of holistic health. Are you with me tonight? Okay, the World Health Organization defines mental health this way. Mental health is a state of mental well-being that enables people to cope with the stress of life, realize their abilities, learn well and work well, and contribute to their community. Notice the language here as it's up on the screen behind me. Mental health is a state. It's a state of mental well-being, and that state enables us as individuals and communities to process stress and discern our abilities to learn and to work and to meaningfully contribute. I should also add at the beginning of the series now, the conversation we're having is about mental health and not about mental illness. Everyone in this room tonight possesses mental health, and we will experience challenges in regard to our mental well-being, but not everyone in the room will experience mental illness. The World Health Organization definition of mental health continues this way. It says, it is an integral component of health. Underline and highlight that. It is an integral component of health and well-being that underpins our individual and collective abilities to make decisions, build relationships, and shape the world we live in. So in terms of our working definition, one of the things that we need to notice about the World Health Organization's definition of mental health is that it highlights for us that mental health is an integral part of our holistic health. Stated clearly, mental health is part of our overall health. And on one level, I think that seems obvious. We're like, bro, I get it. We all know that. It's one part of our health. I heard you, I read it, move on. But on another level, it feels to me like in our cultural moment, this often goes ignored. We often treat mental health on its own without relating it to other aspects of our overall health. And I think it's important that we get this, and to be honest up front, this is one of the only points that I want to make tonight at the beginning of this series. Putting adjectives before the word health is functional. It can help us specify mental before health, but it remains fictional because we don't really have mental health on its own. Let me show you what I mean. We do this with other aspects of our health. We'll talk about our spiritual health. We might talk about our physical health. I know you know from seeing me that I like to talk about physical health all the time, just hitting the gym. We have our social health. We have something like our mental health. Notice here, we put adjectives in front of the word health, spiritual, physical, social, mental. We do this to distinguish what we mean, but at the end of the day, there is only health. There is only health. In other words, the terms are functional, but they're fictional. There is no spiritual or physical or social or even mental health. There is only health. And each of these aspects are functional. They might help us describe what we mean, what we're talking about when we say physical health or when we say mental health, but they're helping us describe our overall health as human beings. You see, we're composite creatures. We're designed to be integrated. We're holistic in our design, which means mental health can never be divorced from our biological or our social or even our spiritual health. Are you with me? This distinction is very important tonight because definitions tend to hold us captive. Definitions can frame our reality and predict our futures, and we often, in our cultural moment, and even in the church itself, evaluate mental health without regard for the ways in which our genetics or our social factors or spiritual factors might be contributing to our overall health as human beings. And the danger is that if we pigeonhole our definition strictly to our mind, to our mental landscapes, we're going to end up trying to solve complex problems with the wrong solutions. I just know this as a pastor, as a teacher of the way of Jesus, as someone who has walked the mental health, the depression, the anxiety journey with many people. I see it over coffees. It's so common to hear people say something like, my mental health is suffering, or my mental health is not good. But listen, it's not your mental health that's suffering. It is you that is suffering. It's not your mental health that is doing unwell. It is you that is doing unwell. Mental health is not something we possess. It's not the subject of our sort of cold inquiry. When we speak abstractly about mental health, it often distances us from ourselves. It enables us to participate in a dissociative experience. And then I think when we speak this way, we're kind of implying on one level that we're a victim to a kind of like mysterious and spooky process, and that keeps us from sort of discovering the root causes. It makes us patients instead of participants. When we speak dissociatively about our mental health, the language accidentally makes us patients instead of participants. I'm getting this language from Bessel A. van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score. He describes the problem this way. He says, when we ignore these quintessential dimensions of humanity, we deprive people of ways to heal from trauma and restore their autonomy. Being a patient rather than a participant in one's healing process separates suffering people from their community and alienates them from an inner sense of self. You know, I've often said over the last few years, there is no such thing as mental health. As you can imagine, it is rarely received well or properly understood. So if you're just tuning in now, lean in with me for a moment. Let's not tweet that one line. I am no way implying that mental health or our psychological components do not make up our overall health. I've already said that they do, but I am asserting that we are impacted by far more than just our mental landscapes. The term is functional, but it's also fictional. It can be helpful, but it can also be harmful. It's descriptive, but it's delimiting. Something like mental health is helpful because it helps us specify what we're describing in our discussions, but it's harmful because it often causes us not to adequately consider our holistic health as human beings. So in terms of definition, I simply want to point out that the World Health Organization is exactly right. Mental health is part of our overall health, which means it cannot be discussed apart from our holistic health as human beings. I think we need to think instead about our holistic health. After all, a central tenet of our faith is that we are created by our God as holistic creatures. Are you with me? Now, more on the importance of our creation narrative in a moment. First, I want to introduce you to this handsome bloke. This is Dr. George L. Engel. Come on. Woof, woof. In thinking together about holistic health, I think we are indebted to the work of Engel and what is known as his biopsychosocial model. This came from a seminal article he wrote, The Need for a New Medical Model, a Challenge to Biomedicine, that was published in 1977. And in this article, Engel questioned the assumptions of practitioners, who at the time were largely focused on psychotherapeutic methods at the expense of considering the whole person. And his pushback actually helped reform several spheres of the medical community. And in this article, he argues for a whole person and contextually situated approach to medicine that always includes biology, psychology, and social aspects of disease and illness. So the approach is probably most easily understood as a Venn diagram that looks something like this. So we think about this together. These are the three aspects of health. Notice, when I say that health is an adjective, what I mean, or we put adjectives before health, what I mean is that health is the thing at the middle. It's the convergence point of our biology, our sociology, and our psychology, that this makes up our overall health according to Engel. So we need to think about the biological components of our health, our genetics, our physicality, our neurochemistry, our attractiveness, our typology, the function of our bodies, or our internal organs. That it might just be that when we're not doing well in our bodies, that our health is waning, it may specifically relate to biological factors that are predetermined and genetically hardwired. But we also have to think about the psychological components of this model. Our sense of self, our patterns of thinking, our moods, our emotions, our temperaments, our traits, and our personalities. But then we have to consider our social components, and I gotta say, being married to a therapist and having frequent coffees with people, one thing has become clear to me. Most people, when considering their health and when they discuss their mental health, neglect to consider their social factors. Most often, people don't think about their environments. They don't think about their culture, their family of origin, that's a big one, socioeconomic status, and all other relational components. that it might just be that social factors in any one of our lives are what is contributing to our negative mental health, or what we've come to refer to as mental health, but it's really just our health. Are you with me? Now, Engel's biopsychosocial model rightly asserted that health is this convergence of all these factors. And at one point, apparently, he was sort of chided to say, hey, why don't you include spiritual in the model? And he grinned and apparently said, it's already there. And he explained that the spiritual is grounded in each of the components of his model because the biopsychosocial aspects of medicine are genetically hardwired. Now, I'm sympathetic to his point, but he was a humanist and I'm a theist, so I tend to think differently along with our scriptural authors that the spiritual dimension needs to be included in this paradigm. So there are two ways we could think about this. One, we could just draw a big circle around this and say it's all spiritual. Or maybe next slide, we could actually just add the spiritual component to this and say there are at least 4 spheres we need to consider in considering our overall health. Are you with me? So regardless, the spiritual component might refer to our connection to the transcendent, or being enchanted and believing in mystery. It would relate to our religious practices like singing together tonight, that it relates to our spiritual health when we worship together and we pray together and we do spiritual disciplines together. Another way to think about this that might be easier to see might look something like this. Next slide. Yeah, this one. I made this pretty good, right? Do you know how much time it took to get these little clip people in the middle? I was like, you should be writing your sermon, not working on mini clip people, okay? But the point is this, that as human beings, whoever we are, we stand at the middle of the convergence of all of these things. These are all the things that I've mentioned: genetics, physicality, our environments, transcendence, moods, emotions, temperaments. That as people, if we're gonna talk about health as human beings, whether you're a follower of Jesus or you're not a follower of Jesus, if you wanna think about health, you've gotta think about all of these factors. But in our cultural moment, we are often bound to speaking strictly about psychological components, and we rarely move into the social or the biological or the spiritual aspects of our health. Maybe differently if you're in the room and you come from a community like this one, a more charismatic community. Often when it comes to health, you only consider spiritual dynamics at the expense of the rest of the dynamics. And we will talk more about this in our series, Spirituality, being spiritual people. Religious practice is part of our health, but it's not all of it. And this biopsychosocial spiritual model, I think it pushes us back to our creation narrative. So if you still have it open, look there with me. Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. God said, "Let us make human beings in our image as our likeness, so they can hold sway over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the skies, and over the animals, and over all the earth, and over all the things that move on the earth." So God created human beings in his image. He created them in the image of God. He made them male and female. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and numerous, fill the earth and subjugate it, hold sway over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, and over every creature that creeps on the earth." You see, according to the scriptural story from page 1, human beings are created image-bearing creatures. Notice we're not a mass of tissues and chemicals that have slowly evolved into a living organism through a random and purposeless process, but we are created by a creator. We are woven together with intention, intimacy, and ingenuity in a distinct and awe-inspiring way. We are created in the image and in the likeness of God. But most importantly, notice, we're not created to be compartmentalized creatures. We're created to be integrated creatures, holistic creatures relating to God and ourselves and one another and creation. It might look something like this. Look at this slide behind me. As we think of a biopsychosocial spiritual model, we see it at work actually here in Genesis 1, but we also see it in the second creation narrative. Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, Yahweh God shaped the Adam from the Adamah, the person from the ground. He blew into its nostrils living breath, and the human person became a living being. In the second account here, we see that God takes the dirt from the ground and breathes into the dirt and divine breath come together to make a nefesh chaya, a living being. A singular substance animated by divine breath. You see, we are created here to be holistic creatures, composite creatures The important word I want to get across here, if you're taking notes, is that we're created for integration. We're created to know God and other and self and creation. We're designed to be connected to each of these things. But unfortunately, as creatures who are bent on brokenness, notice that language, we tend to divide these components. We will often compartmentalize ourselves. Are you with me? And in so doing, what we experience is not integration, but disintegration. And unsurprisingly, disintegration is exactly what takes place in our primary teaching text for tonight, the so-called fall narrative, but maybe we should refer to this as the disintegration narrative. These images of a man and a woman and God and a talking snake might actually diagnose our disintegration. So you have it open, turn over Genesis chapter 3, verse 1. Now the snake was the shrewdest of all the creatures of the wild that Yahweh God had made. And it, that is the snake, said to the woman, "Did God really say you will not eat from any tree in the garden?" The woman said to the snake, "Listen, we may eat from the fruit of the trees in the garden, but from the fruit of the tree that's in the middle of the garden, God said, you will not eat of it and you will not touch it so that you don't die." So in Genesis 3, the scene shifts and we're actually introduced to a new character in the drama, the serpent, whose title is kind of a wordplay on sorcery and divination. And we're introduced to a diviner who is kind of the shrewdest of all creatures created by God. He's wise with a plan. He's skeptical, able to conceal. And his first move, notice, is to emphasize words that seem negative. He wants to twist the words just a little bit. As Dallas Willard famously put it, the snake doesn't hit Eve with a stick, but with an idea. The snake aims for her mental landscape. The snake goes after her mind because the seeds of distrust, disunity, and disintegration come from sowing seeds of doubt about God, ourselves, one another, and creation. The snake's first move is to ask some questions. Verse 4, the snake said to the woman, "You won't die at all. It's actually that God knows that the day you eat of it, your eyes are going to be open, you'll become like gods, knowing good and bad." And so the woman saw that the tree was good to eat. It was an object of longing to the eyes, and the tree was desirable for giving insight. So she took of its fruit and ate. She also gave some to her man with her, and he ate. And the eyes of the two of them opened, and they knew that they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. Notice the snake's second move here is to directly contradict words spoken by God. The snake not only contradicts God's previous word, but he proceeds to ascribe self-serving motives to God, thus undermining God's credibility in her eyes. And then his final move is to invite her to imagine that God is holding out on her. The tree is not only attractive, but by taking its fruit, you're going to get what God clearly does not want to give you. Eat from this tree and you will enter into a higher plane of existence. And so the snake amplifies the negative, contradicts words, and sowed seeds of disunity. And the woman is seduced by this idea. She comes to think that God actually created, she thinks that God did not actually create heaven, but God made hell. And in seizing upon the fruit, she's going to try to turn hell toward heaven. See, she prefers to rule in her self-created hell rather than being a servant in heaven. She covets now the thing that will kill her because she's embraced an alternative narrative that's been peddled by the snake. See, instead of realizing that her true desire will only be fulfilled by trusting in God and eating from the tree of life, she mistakenly chooses the tree instead of the tree maker. And by embracing the snake's interpretation of the tree, she sees the knowing of good and bad as a desirable path to true wisdom, in spite of the fact that it leads to folly and death. And the results are abysmal, and this is kind of what I'm pushing towards tonight. Chapter 3, verse 8. They, that is the man and the woman, heard the sound of Yahweh God walking about in the garden in the storm of the day. Yes, the storm of the day. So the man and his woman hid from the face of Yahweh God among the trees in the garden. Yahweh God called to the man and said to him, "Where are you?" He said, "I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid." He said, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree that I ordered you not to eat from?" And the man said, "The woman you put with me, she gave it to me from the tree, and I ate." And Yahweh God said to the woman, "What is this that you've done?" And the woman said, "The snake, it deceived me." And so maybe a paradigm for this section that looks something like this. There's a first question: where are you? And notice the human response is evasive. They're experiencing fear and shame for the first time. Are you with me? Fear can go to hell. Shame can go there too. Not here, apparently. Not for many of us most often. Are you with me? God then asks a second question: who told you to eat of this? First question, where are you, fear and shame? Yeah, they hear God, they hide. Second question, who told you? And then notice that the man blames the woman. Yep. She just said, yep. And then God asks the woman, "What have you done?" And then she blames the snake. So there's a chain reaction of blame displacement that emerges here. So the narrative shows us their first instinct is to hide from God and each other because they're experiencing on a narrative level for the first time fear and shame. They're hiding. And fear and shame illustrates not only the breakdown in their relationship to God and one another, but a breakdown within their own self. Are you with me? That fear and shame causes us to have disassociative experiences within our own self. And they're for the first time experiencing this with evasiveness and blame displacement. Who told you? It was the woman you gave me. What have you done? The snake, the original gaslighter, he told me to do it. And notice this, that this ancient scroll written 2 millennia ago points to this very same reality, that there is not integration in Genesis 3, like God made us to be holistic creatures. There is the breakdown of our very selves at work in this narrative. That the self is being broken down as we experience shame and fear. There's disharmony and disintegration in our own bodies, that we hide from others. That the social connection that we're designed for, we sever it because we're afraid. We hide from God, which eliminates any spiritual component that could possibly flood through our veins. And there is a storm in the garden for the first time. We love that translation. God was walking in the breeze of the day. Like it's an Old Spice commercial or something. It's so crazy. But it's actually more like the sound of trees hitting together. It's almost like because of what the humans have done, nature, creation, the ground itself is experiencing the repercussions of their choice. That for the first time in the narrative, the humans who are to rule over the ground are actually being ruled over by the ground. The ground is responding, creation and nature itself is erupting. And if we're honest, I think we often follow the pathway of our spiritual mothers and fathers, forfeiting health in order to pursue our own kinds of wisdom, which ultimately leads to our disintegration. Friends, we're not created to be compartmentalized creatures. We are created to be holistic creatures, relating to God and ourselves and one another and creation. We are designed to be integrated, not disintegrated. We are designed to have a healthy sense of self, to be connected healthily to others, to be spiritually connected to God, and to be connected to nature and creation. We divide ourselves, but God wants to unify the self. You see, the mind is its own place, and in itself can make a hell of heaven, a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. You know, if you keep reading this section of Paradise Lost, the first thing you notice is that these words are actually spoken by the snake, the serpent. The devil is the one who says this, and he continues this way. He says this: "What matter where, if I be still the same? And what I should be, all but less than he whom thunder hath made greater. Here at last we shall be free. The Almighty hath not built here for his envy, will not drive us hence. Here we may reign secure, and in my choice, to reign is worth ambition, though in hell. Better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven." See, God creates us to be integrated, holistic creatures, bio, psycho, social, spiritual, and we, by our own choice, sometimes by circumstances, sometimes through force, and other times through fear, we often move towards disintegration. So we turn to the question once more tonight, how do we navigate our mental health moment? And if I can put everything together that I've tried to say to you tonight and show you actually that our scriptural authors also point to this very same reality, I would say a couple things. First, it is incontestable that we live in a mental health moment. Are you with me? The stats, the data, it's in. It's not looking good. In our mental health moment, I'm trying to suggest that we often focus on one aspect of our health at the expense of others. I want to suggest that God designs you and me to be integrated, bio, psycho, social, spiritual, but we tend to ignore our design and seize upon our own forms of wisdom that cause our disintegration, the breakdown of our bio, psycho, social, and spiritual aspects. And God's prerogative in the face of our disintegration, again and again, what God desires for us is to nurse us back to health, which is going to require an integrated approach because God created us for integration. You know, we often use the word salvation to describe an event, a kind of singular moment in time, but there's a reason why that word is also translated as healing, mending, and restoring. You see, God's salvation is intended to mend every aspect of our being, bio, psycho, social, spiritual, not only in the future, but also now. That as we are coming apart at the seams, God's prerogative is to put us back together. See, the hope of our faith is not to be skyrocketed to heaven. The hope of our faith is that God would make us whole, that our death would be transfigured into life, and ultimately that our disintegration would be overcome by integration. I've seen this time and time again in my own life, but I want to tell you a story of something that's happened to me over the last 2 years that illustrates everything I've tried to say to you tonight. It was almost 2 years ago that we moved my mother from Moncton, New Brunswick on the east coast of Canada here to Calgary. I mean, it was a significant move. She'd been living on the coast for 60 years. She had never lived anywhere else. And she had spent the better part of the last few decades trying to pick up the pieces from trauma and abandonment and despair in her own life, which were all compounded by a son, my brother, wrestling through his own addictions, which obviously negatively impacted her. She, like many others in generations that are older than ours, were never really given the tools to properly process her own health, which then led to feeling isolated, sometimes by choice and other times by circumstance. She disliked her work and she lacked strong community, and that led to unhealthy eating habits, which were worsened by her decreased physical activity. The trauma, isolation, lack of meaning, unhealthy food choices, and lack of physical activity was a downward spiral that she honestly didn't want to admit was ruining her life. Instead, her fear and her shame kept her from disclosing much of this even to me. And even though I knew aspects of it, I did not know the full extent of it. Tragically, this spiral turned to suicidal ideation, thinking she might be more helpful if she were gone. Which, to be honest, hurts my heart more than I am humanly capable of expressing. And the doctors wanted to help, and so on limited resources and time, the doctors treated her mind. They gave her anxiety and depression medication, which definitely helped, but for her and for many others, they were not a permanent solution. The medication helped aspects of her anxiety and depression, but the other patterns continued for several years, and so over time, the dosage just needed to increase. And I was only really made aware of the severity of her circumstance when she moved here. And over these last 2 years, I just want to say that I've watched things slowly change. She has people in her life who want to journey with her in learning about the ways that we can properly process our health. She's got a community of people who just deeply love her and can demonstrate that love every day. And part of that community are two little humans called Alethea and Atticus, and I gotta say, they're some of the greatest people alive. Her work, which is partial retirement and then partially being with our littles, is very meaningful work. Her eating has radically changed. She started doing physical activity again. I mean, initially she was kind of forced because she's around a 2-year-old all the time. These shifts actually led to her coming off all her medications. But even more fun, it's led to her getting her passport for the first time in her life at age 60, traveling, driving in Calgary, which is much more intimidating than the Maritimes, entering into new environments, getting connected to the outdoors, spiritually coming alive in a new way, and learning from forced experience that is being around me that conflict is not to be feared, but it's a part of deep life together. And to be honest, friends, I have watched my mother move from death to life with my own eyes, and it was pretty much exclusively because she slowly experienced a move from disintegration to integration. And her desire for life, her zeal for life has returned. And she's not fully arrived, but she's experienced significant transformation which only started when her whole person was considered. Biology, psychology, sociology, and spirituality. When my mother moved from patient to participant, things started to change. And she wanted me to share this story with you tonight, because she's come to realize how common it is to have these types of experiences, that her story is not just her story, but it's a common story, and that while the journey is tough, there is hope. There is hope if we're willing to consider holistic aspects of our health together. As I was preparing and thinking through my mom's story, and if I'm honest, writing this out and weeping today, I do cry, I am not a robot. It also reminded me, it's gonna make me sound like a robot, it reminded me of a scene from Shakespeare's Macbeth, where Lady Macbeth's been experiencing tumultuous visions, and Macbeth says this to the doctor. He says, "How goes the patient?" And the doctor says, "Not so sick, my lord, as she is troubled with thick coming fancies that keep her from rest." And then Macbeth says this, "Cure her of that. Canst thou not minister to her mind, to a mind diseased, pluck from the memory a rooted sorrow, raise out the written troubles of the brain, and with some sweet, oblivious antidote, cleanse the stuffed bosom of that perilous stuff which weighs upon her heart." In other words, can't you just give her a pill or pluck out the memory? And the doctor says this, therein the patient must minister to himself. In other words, there is no easy remedy for this. In order for the remedy to come, she can't be a patient, she has to be a participant. In all of this, I think that we are all invited to navigate the mental health moment that we live in by moving from patient to participant, because when we ignore the holistic dimensions of our humanity, we deprive ourselves and God and others of ways to heal from trauma, because being a patient rather than a participant in the healing process separates suffering people from community, and it alienates us from our very selves. I think we need to stop being passive about our own health journeys. More than that, as followers of Jesus, we need to stop being passive about the health journey of others. We need to begin to participate alongside each other, that we would bear the burdens as Messiah bore our burdens. And I get it, we cannot care this way about everyone, but there are people in all of our lives that we need to journey alongside of as they move towards health. I tell the story about my mom tonight, not because I'm some kind of hero in her life by doing all of these things, but because this is the basic stuff that we're called to do as followers of Jesus. With the Spirit in us, enabling us and empowering us to journey alongside people that they can become whole. I'm not a hero. I'm doing the basic stuff that we're called to do as followers of Jesus, to learn well together what mental health is and then walk alongside people on the holistic health journey, because God designed them and you and me for holistic health and integration, not disintegration. And so the World Health Organization defines mental health as a state of mental well-being that enables people to cope with the stresses of life, realize their abilities, learn well, work well, and contribute to their community. It's an integral component of health and well-being that underpins our individual and collective abilities to make decisions, build relationships, and shape the world we live in. And this process is challenging, and so as I end our time tonight, I just want to very briefly offer a type of checklist. 7 things that we should all be thinking about as we think about our holistic health and the health of our neighbor. This is a checklist I use in my own life. It's a checklist I use alongside my mother. And it's sort of a conglomerate of sort of research that emerges from the World Health Organization and Statistics Canada and other avenues where they try to target and pinpoint areas that we need to think about and focus in on if we want to contribute to our holistic health. And so if we want to move from patient to participant, here are 7 things we should think about. 1, we need to think about our sense of self. Do we have a healthy sense of self? Do we know ourselves? Oftentimes, we are not helpful with this in church and as followers of Jesus. You know, Paul says to the Galatians, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, it is Christ who lives in me. Then he says this, but the life that I now live, oh, it's a redefined I. One that has been crucified and raised with Jesus. There is a healthy sense of self that we all must have as human beings in order to be healthy in the world that we live in. Are you with me? 2nd, we need connection. We need community, we need relationships, and yes, we need belonging. We need connections. For so many of us in our hyper-connected moment, we are so disconnected from each other. And with disconnection comes disintegration. We need to be connected. 3rd, we need integrated activity in our lives. We need work, we need play, we need competence, we need opportunity to have flow. I don't know about you, but when I feel like I'm mastering something or I'm enveloped in something or I'm good or competent at something, I have a healthier sense of self. I feel better about who I am because we're designed for work. We're designed for flow. We're designed to be competent and we're designed to play. Are you with me? Just hang out with a 2.5-year-old and you will see you are designed to play. My daughter has learned how to dance from me. Can you believe that? It's pretty good. It's pretty good. 4, we need to centralize our values. And many of us, our health is struggling because we don't know what we believe or what we value or the direction of our lives. It's very difficult in the moment that we live in. There's so much on offer, so much we can choose from, and choice paralysis really does come for all of us, doesn't it? But what we can do is begin to think about intrinsic motivators. What has God created me to do? What has God called me to do? What is the purpose that God has placed on my life? We need to make sure that we know what our values are, and in any given moment, we are pursuing and embodying those values. Our health will increase as we do that. 5, we need to process our past. Whoops. We will talk more about this in the weeks to come. But I want to tell you something. Your brain, most of you in the room have one of those tonight. Your brain cannot tell the difference between a past and a present event. Your brain cannot tell the difference between the past and the present. You can tell yourself in your prefrontal cortex what is past and present, but on a subcortical, in your amygdala, when it gets into the fight or flight mode, it can't tell the difference between past and present. So when something is triggering based on our trauma, it will be as though that past event is fully present. We truly, on a brain level, cannot escape our past. We must process our past. For many of us, one of the reasons why our health is struggling is because our past is right here. And if you come from a family like mine, where there is family of origin brokenness and abuse and addiction, there is much to be processed. There's pain to go through. But we have to process our past. 6, We need natural world connection. We need ecotherapy. I live in the Beltline, so it's like truly a concrete jungle. So I've had to, it's like a practice of touching trees, like when I'm walking, just like St. Francis, you got to preach to the trees, The trees need the gospel too, are you with me? It's I was in Vancouver one time on a walk, stayed up too late, probably feeling really spiritual, and I went up to this tree, and I was like, you know that God's gonna redeem you, right? And I meant it, I really did mean it. All creation is longing, friends. We're designed to be connected to creation, yes? And when it's not just our phones and our digital media, that 2021 study, 13 hours a day of digital media is consumed by us. We live near the mountains. Let's not settle for being in homes and coffee shops all the time. We need to be out. I get it, when there's a polar vortex, it's impossible. No one can live in these conditions. But generally speaking, we live in a very livable city, and Chinooks make being outdoors easier. The sun is often up. We need to get outside. You gotta touch grass. You've gotta be connected to the real world. Hear me, connected to the real world. So much of our lives is disconnected from the real world. And as the band returns, we need to help one another regain hope for the future. Oh man, one of the greatest predictors of our holistic health as human beings is if we lose hope for the future, our health will fade. It will fade. Viktor Frankl, in his great book, Man's Search for Meaning, writes about being in the concentration camps in Auschwitz. And he says that he could predict while he was in the camps with a high degree of probability when someone was going to pass because they'd given up hope that they would ever get out. That hope for the future is so important, and so we have to help one another maintain hope. Look, I'm just gonna tell you that one of the reasons why I still follow Jesus is because I believe that God will transfigure death and turn it to life. I believe that God will overcome suffering and he will bring newness. I believe that the trajectory that we're on, the arc of eschatology, the direction that this whole thing is going is one of redemption and new creation. We need hope for what God is going to do. And just know that as you share your story, the person next to you, the person in the seat beside you, they need to hear your story so they know that if it can happen for you, it can happen for them. So the data is clear. We live in a mental health moment that demands that we start focusing on our holistic health. Our holistic health is illustrated by Dr. Engel's biopsychosocial model, which tries to put language to this scriptural idea that we're created in Genesis 1 and 2 to be integrated. But as we've seen in Genesis 3, as evidenced by the man, the woman, and the snake, we often move from integration to disintegration. In the face of our disintegration, what God wants for all of us is that we move to holistic health, that we experience salvation not only in the future, but in the present. But for that to happen, as we begin this journey together, we need to move from simply being patients in relation to our mental health to becoming participants in the journey of our holistic health. Friends, the mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. May we tonight take a step on this journey together of becoming those whose minds do not make hell of heaven, but can learn to make heaven of hell. Let's pray together. Yeah, God, we acknowledge together, we declare together that fear can go to hell and shame can go there too. God, there's so much disintegration in our city and there's so much disintegration in this room. God, we need you to come and to help us. God, I just pray for the courage for each one in the room as we begin a series like this that is so close to home for all of us. 87% of us, God, are experiencing this on a deep level. Would you help us on the journey of discovering holistic health biologically, psychologically, sociologically, spiritually, God, that we would be holistic people before you. God, we long for you to be a part of this health journey, that you would help us to have a sound mind. Pray these things in the name of Jesus. Amen.